It was a story that shook up a small town in the southern United States. The town, known for its calm and measured life, seemed unremarkable to outsiders. But every place has its secrets. This town was no exception. Among the well-kept houses and green streets, there were dark corners where life went by completely different rules. The homeless in this city rarely attracted the attention of local residents. They were there, but no one noticed them, not because there were few of them, but because people preferred not to see those who found themselves outside the normal life. One of these invisible was a 40-year-old man named Thomas. His life was once different. He had a home, a family, a job, but all this was left in the past. Thomas lost everything, gradually sinking to the bottom. He became one of those who wander the streets, earning a living through petty theft and odd jobs. Thomas lived in an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. This house had once been a cozy family nest, but now its walls were dilapidated and the roof was leaking. Local children were often afraid of this place, considering it a haunted house. But for Thomas, it was his refuge, a place where he could hide from prying eyes and spend the night under a roof. Far from these dark corners of the city lived a family that seemed perfect. A mother, a father, and their daughter, Emily. Emily was an ordinary girl, a typical teenager with ordinary interests. She was 14 years old. She studied at the local school, had several friends, and led a life no different from other children her age. Her parents loved her, but were often busy with their careers and their own concerns, so Emily spent a lot of time on her own. Her curiosity, inherent in all teenagers, often led her to places where other children did not dare to go. Emily was drawn to mystery, and when she first saw Thomas on the street, something about him caught her attention. He was unremarkable to most passers-by. His haggard face, his dirty clothes, his look of despair. But to Emily, he was more than just another homeless person. She didn't understand how anyone could live like that. What led people to end up in such a situation? Her childish naivety prevented her from seeing the danger in it. Soon she began to see Thomas on the street more and more often. He would sit on the corner of the local store, sometimes asking passers-by for change, sometimes just staring into space. Emily felt sorry for him, and she began to notice him every day. She didn't tell anyone about it, not her parents, not her friends. It was her little secret. She began to talk to Thomas, at first timidly, then more and more openly. He seemed like a man who had just had bad luck in life, not a threat. These conversations began with innocent topics, how he was doing, what he did before he ended up on the streets. Thomas was careful in his answers, but over time he began to open up. He talked about how he lost his job, how he was kicked out of his home, and how he ended up alone on the streets. Emily felt sorry for him. She felt that she could help him, that he deserved a second chance. Her young age did not allow her to see him as a threat. Instead, she saw him as a person in need. But for Thomas, these conversations had a different meaning. He saw Emily not just as a girl, but as someone who could become part of his twisted fantasy. At first, he was careful not to show his true face, but his dark thoughts began to influence his behavior more and more. Meanwhile, Emily's parents were oblivious. They were sure that their daughter was safe, that nothing could threaten her in their small town. Thomas remained as invisible to them as he was to everyone else. And they had no idea that their daughter was increasingly crossing paths with the man who would soon destroy their lives. Thomas and Emily began to meet more and more often in the same place. It was a small park near the school, where Emily sometimes spent time after classes, sitting on a bench and thinking about her own things. Thomas seemed to choose this park for a reason. He knew that during the day there were fewer people there, and this place allowed him to remain unnoticed. He sat on the far benches, under the trees, watching the passers-by. It was here that they began their first long conversations, which slowly but surely became more and more personal. Emily had always been curious. She wanted to know how a man like Thomas had ended up in such a situation. At first, she was too shy to get too close, just walking past, pretending not to notice him. But one day, when Thomas looked especially tired and haggard, she decided she had to do something. She walked up to him and offered him a sandwich she had bought on her way home from school. Thomas was surprised, but accepted the food, smiling gratefully. "Thanks, baby," he muttered, taking the sandwich from her hands. Emily smiled back, relieved. It was the first time she had come this close to him, and although she felt a little uneasy, her inner urge to help overcame her fear. She sat down on a bench nearby and watched Thomas eat. A few minutes passed, and Thomas himself spoke. "You shouldn't talk to people like me. People don't like it when kids talk to homeless people." Emily shrugged, unsure of what to say. She felt sorry for the man. He looked like everyone in the world had turned their backs on him. She didn't know his past, but her youthful naivety told her that things weren't as simple as they seemed at first glance. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly after a short pause. Thomas looked at her, wondering if he should answer. His eyes were tired, with deep lines around them that spoke volumes, of years on the streets, of disappointments and losses. But something about Emily made him want to tell her, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "I lost everything," he said dryly. "I once had a family, I once had a job, and now—" Emily listened attentively, without interrupting. She was interested not so much in what he had lost, but in how it had happened. Why did a man with a family and a job end up on the street? "How did this happen?" she asked, becoming more and more drawn into the conversation. Thomas sighed, looking around as if checking for prying ears. His voice became quieter, and there was a bitter edge to it. "It's a long story, baby. Sometimes life just doesn't go where you planned. Everything falls apart in an instant, and you don't even have time to notice." Emily thought about that. To her, as a teenager, life had seemed predictable and stable. She couldn't imagine that someone could lose control of their destiny so much that they ended up on the streets. Her parents had always taken care of her. They had a home, a job. There was room for mistakes in her world, but not for such devastating falls. But there was no judgment in her gaze on Thomas. On the contrary, she felt a kindred sympathy for him. Although their lives had been very different, Emily had already faced feelings of loneliness in her younger years, although it was not as clear and terrifying as Thomas's. He was a grown man, but in his eyes she saw the same search for meaning that she sometimes felt herself. Over time, their meetings in the park became regular. Emily began to come here more and more often, sometimes to buy food for Thomas, sometimes just to talk. These conversations became her secret, a little secret that she did not share with anyone. Her friends from school and her parents did not know anything about her spending her time in the company of a homeless man. Adults, in her opinion, would not understand her. They would only see danger, only the fact that Thomas is a person who lives on the streets, and this automatically makes him suspicious. But Emily saw something more behind it, a person with a past, with stories that no one has heard yet. Thomas, too, began to become increasingly attached to these meetings. He was used to loneliness, and had not interacted with people so closely for a long time. Emily became for him something like a ray of light in his dark, ruined life. But this light did not bring him peace. On the contrary, his mind, exhausted by years of living on the street, began to develop plans. Something dark and dangerous was awakening in him. He no longer saw Emily as just a kind girl who brought him food. His thoughts became more and more twisted and dark, but he continued to hide it behind a mask of friendliness. He knew that he must not frighten her, must not seem dangerous to her. Emily, however, didn't notice the change in his behavior. She continued to think that Thomas was just a man who had had some bad luck and needed help. She couldn't see him as a predator who was slowly but surely getting closer. Thus, their meetings, which for Emily were innocent and simple, began to take a sinister turn for Thomas. Dangerous thoughts were born in his head, which would soon lead to disaster. The more they talked, the more Thomas became imbued with these feelings, and the more acute the question became, how long will it take before all this gets out of control? Emily continued to meet Thomas in the park more and more often. Each day she spent more time with him, not realizing how dangerous this communication was becoming. The park she visited became their place, a quiet corner, hidden among the trees, where no one could see them. Thomas chose this park for a reason. He understood that he could remain unnoticed here, and Emily, in turn, believed that their meetings were harmless. Her parents remained busy and uninterested in where she spent her time after school. They trusted their daughter, believing her to be a sensible girl, and this trust gave Emily freedom. But behind this freedom, there was something darker. Thomas, feeling attached to Emily, began to take an increasing interest in her life. He asked about her friends, family, and school, pretending to be simply curious, but there was hidden interest in his eyes. He began to use her stories to better understand her weaknesses. His desire to control the situation and direct her actions became stronger. Emily shared her worries with him, not realizing that for Thomas it was more than just a friendly conversation. She saw him as a man who had had bad luck in life, but she did not suspect that behind his smile there were dangerous intentions. Each time they met, Thomas behaved more and more persistently, gradually instilling in Emily a sense of dependence on their communication. Thomas increasingly thought about how he could use her trust to his advantage. He felt that his control over the situation was increasing, and he liked this feeling. He began to persuade Emily to spend more time with him, offering to go further away from the park, where no one would see them. Despite her inner fears, Emily agreed, not wanting to lose contact with the person who, as she felt, needed her help. One day, Thomas made a move that should have alerted her. He invited her to his abandoned house, claiming that he had something interesting that she should see. Emily hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She decided that this was just another adventure, and did not see it as a threat. For her, this was another stage of their strange friendship, and she did not understand that this step would be fatal. Thomas, however, knew he was getting closer to his goal. He was becoming more and more lost in his dark fantasies every day, and his plans were becoming clearer. He knew he couldn't wait forever, and every day he saw Emily only made him more determined to see it through. On the eve of their meeting at the abandoned house, Thomas carefully thought out his actions. He understood that everything depended on this moment. He no longer saw Emily as a simple girl. She had become an object for him, which he intended to completely control. Dark images of what he was going to do flashed in his head. Emily, unsuspecting, went to the meeting, believing that it would be just another day of their communication. She could not know that this day would be the last step on the path to tragedy. The next day, Emily was going to meet Thomas, as agreed, at his abandoned house on the outskirts of town. She tried not to attract the attention of her parents, as always, by telling them that she was going to see a friend. It had become a habit for her to hide where she was really going. Her parents did not ask unnecessary questions, and she felt safe, believing that her little secret would remain undisclosed. As she approached the old house, a slight sense of unease washed over her, but she quickly suppressed it, convincing herself that everything was under control. The house looked abandoned, gloomy, with a collapsed roof and peeling paint on the walls. The place seemed ominous even in the daytime, but Emily did not want to show her fear. She was used to trusting Thomas, and so even the thought that something bad could happen did not fit into her head. Thomas was waiting for her inside. He had prepared the house for her arrival, trying to hide the worst aspects of his home by removing debris and bringing in old blankets to create the appearance of comfort. But despite his efforts, the place was still eerie. It was damp and cold inside, smelling of mold and decay. The walls were covered in dirt, and the windows had long since been broken. Emily's heart began to beat faster when she entered. She looked around and her doubts grew, but Thomas, when he met her, tried to behave as friendly as possible. He offered her a seat and began to tell her some stories, trying to relax her, to distract her from where she was. Emily listened, but she felt out of place. She understood that this place was not for her, but being trusting and naive, she could not immediately find the strength to leave. Meanwhile, Thomas watched her every move carefully. He saw that the girl was nervous, but he was in no hurry to force the situation. He knew that a little more, and her fear would disappear, and her trust in him would finally take root. He was used to hiding his true intentions behind a mask of goodwill, and this time was no exception. Every gesture of his was calculated, every word thought out, so as not to frighten her. Emily, sitting on the old sofa, felt the cold coming from the walls of the house. Thomas, noticing her discomfort, brought her an old blanket. She accepted it with gratitude, but it did not ease her condition. Everything around her seemed wrong. The strange silence, the dark corners of the room and Thomas's gaze, which seemed somehow different. But her own desire to believe that everything was under control forced her to stay. Meanwhile, Emily's parents had no idea what was going on. They were sure their daughter was safe. Their relationship with their daughter was built on trust, and they did not check where she spent her time. Emily, in turn, became more and more entangled in her lies. She made up several stories for her parents and friends to explain where she spent her days. Her lies became more and more elaborate, and each time she felt more confident in her fabrications. Thomas, however, continued to methodically lure her into his net. He began to speak more and more frankly to Emily, telling stories from his past. His stories became increasingly dark, but he tried not to show his true face. He talked about how he lost everything, how he ended up on the street, how his family abandoned him. His words aroused Emily's sympathy, and she began to feel more and more responsible for his fate. This was his main game. He knew how to make her feel that only she could help him. Time passed slowly in the house. Emily gradually began to get used to the environment, although her inner voice still told her that something was wrong. Thomas, seeing her indecision, did not hurry. He knew that he had to act carefully. He understood that every wrong step could ruin everything, and his patience was his main weapon. By the end of their meeting, Emily no longer felt the fear that had gripped her when she entered the house. She began to think that her fears were unfounded, that Thomas was simply an unhappy man in need of support. Her trust in him had grown, and that was exactly what he wanted. Thomas was pleased inside. He had managed to convince Emily to stay longer than she had originally planned. She had left, but promised to return, and this was a sign to him that his plan was starting to work. Now he knew he could go further. His control over the situation had increased, and he could see a clear path to his goal. Emily's head was full of thoughts as she walked home. She thought that Thomas wasn't who they thought he was. Her parents, friends, and those around her might not understand him, but she saw in him what others didn't. She had found the day unusual, but not scary. She assured herself that she could handle the situation, that she was smart and knew what she was doing. However, what she considered innocent friendship was something completely different for Thomas. Plans were being born in his head that would soon lead to tragic events. His control over Emily was growing stronger every day, and he already knew that the next step would be decisive. Thomas remained in his abandoned house, pondering how he had managed to get closer to his goal. His dark thoughts became more and more obsessive. He knew that the moment when he would be able to completely subjugate Emily was already close. The only question was how long it would take him to finally break her trust and force her to submit. As the days went by, the meetings between Thomas and Emily became more frequent. Each new meeting was a step towards the inevitable. Thomas methodically increased his influence on the girl, hiding his dark essence behind a mask of sympathy and care. His plan was simple: gradually deprive Emily of free will, lock her in his reality, where only he could control her. Emily continued to think that she was in control of the situation, but she did not notice how she was falling deeper and deeper into the trap set by Thomas. One day after school, Emily went to Thomas's abandoned house again. He was waiting for her, as always, ready to continue his manipulative game. But this time, the atmosphere inside the house seemed even more oppressive. Perhaps it was just her inner feeling, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The house seemed even colder, the darkness in the corners of the rooms became ominous, and Thomas looked nervous, although he tried to hide it. Emily felt uneasy from the moment she walked in. Her inner voice warned her of danger, but she suppressed her fears again. Thomas invited her to sit down again, starting, as usual, with stories about his life. But now there was something strange in his voice, something that made Emily wary. She could no longer ignore the growing sense of danger, but she still did not dare leave. Thomas, in turn, realized that he was approaching the point where he had to act. He was ready to do anything to subjugate her completely. His thoughts were obsessive and dark. He could no longer restrain his desires. He understood that this moment would be decisive. Either he would be able to achieve his goal, or everything would collapse. With every word, with every look, he tried to strengthen his power over Emily, but something in her behavior alarmed him. She became more withdrawn. Her smile no longer seemed so sincere. Emily began to realize that their relationship was no longer just friendship. Thoughts began to form in her head that something was wrong. She tried to interrupt the conversation and say that she needed to leave. However, Thomas was ready for this. He stood up, blocking her way to the exit. The situation changed instantly. Emily felt panic. Her heart began to beat faster, and she began to realize that she was in real danger. Thomas, seeing her fear, knew this was his moment. All the barriers in his mind collapsed, and he decided to act. Emily tried to step back, but her back was already touching the cold wall of the abandoned house. Thomas, who had always seemed weak and broken to her, suddenly turned into a predator. There was no more kindness in his eyes, only cold and ruthless intent. She tried to resist, but her efforts were useless. Thomas was stronger, and his rage overwhelmed him. He grabbed her, and in that moment, everything happened quickly. Muffled thuds echoed throughout the room, and the struggle that lasted for a few minutes ended tragically. Emily could no longer move, her body went limp, and an ominous silence fell over the room. Thomas stood over her body, breathing heavily, realizing what he had just done. His thoughts were in chaos, but there was no regret inside him. He knew that it was inevitable, that his plan, which he had been hatching for so long, was now complete. He had succeeded in subduing her, but the price had been high. He had killed her. He looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. His mind was foggy, and everything seemed unreal. Time seemed to slow down. Thomas looked at Emily's motionless body and realized that now he had to cover up the crime. Panic began to rise in his chest, but he quickly pulled himself together. He needed to act fast so that no one would know what had happened in this abandoned house. Thomas was an expert at hiding from society, and now he had to cover up the evidence of a murder. He quickly began to remove all signs of a struggle, lifting Emily's body and dragging it to a more private place. He acted mechanically, as if in a trance, performing actions that were for him an integral part of his inner chaos. As the body was hidden, Thomas paused for a moment, realizing that his life was now forever changed. He was no longer just a homeless man living in the shadows of society. He was now a murderer. The silence of the house became more and more oppressive, and in that moment, he realized that he would have to live with this crime for the rest of his days. After the murder, Thomas was in a state of shock. The realization of what he had done had not yet fully dawned on him. But he knew one thing: there was no turning back now. His thoughts were shattered into fragments of panic and adrenaline, and all he could do was act on autopilot to cover up the crime. His first decision was to hide Emily's body. Around the house where he lived, there were many abandoned places, empty buildings and neglected yards where no one had been for years. Thomas knew these places like the back of his hand, because these places had been his refuge for many years. He knew that he had a small amount of time before someone started looking for the girl, and he needed to act quickly. Thomas knew that if the body was found, they would soon start looking for him. He glanced at her lifeless body, knowing that no one would help Emily anymore. It was just evidence that could destroy him. He took an old, dirty blanket that he had once used for sleeping and wrapped the girl's body in it. His movements were mechanical, as if his mind had switched off, leaving only instincts. The abandoned house he lived in was on the outskirts of town, and next to it was an empty field overgrown with thick grass and brush. That's where Thomas headed, dragging Emily's body along the ground. He chose one of the more overgrown areas, hoping that no one would look for anything suspicious there. When he found a suitable spot, he began digging a shallow grave, using an old, rusty shovel he found in the backyard of the house. The ground was hard and the process was slow, but Thomas continued digging, as if in a trance. When the hole was ready, he lowered the body into it, covering it with earth and leaves. Everything that reminded him of the girl was now hidden under a thin layer of dirt. Thomas paused for a moment, trying to comprehend what had happened, but instead his thoughts wandered further and further into the void. He knew that this was not the end. This was only the beginning of his new life, a life filled with the fear of being caught. After hiding the body, Thomas returned to the house, where his mind began to return to reality. He looked around and realized that he needed to destroy any evidence that could connect him to Emily. The first thing he did was get rid of the things the girl might have left behind: her backpack, her school notebooks, and the small personal items she brought with her to their meetings. He threw them into an old iron bin in the backyard and set them on fire. The flames shot up, devouring everything that reminded him of her existence in this place. Thomas carefully examined the room where the murder had taken place. He removed all traces of a struggle, wiped the floors, destroyed any bloodstains or marks that might have been left behind from the incident. He knew that the slightest mistake could lead to his capture. Every corner had been carefully checked, and it seemed that the house was back to how it had been before Emily had entered. When the work was finished, Thomas felt a strange sense of emptiness. He sat in the old chair, feeling the strength leaving his body. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from physical fatigue and stress. Killing Emily was not only a destructive act for him, but also a new stage in his life, full of fear and inevitable retribution. Thomas knew that his actions would not go unnoticed. Soon the police would start searching for the girl, and then his whole life would be in danger. He was no longer just a homeless man hiding in an abandoned house. Now he was a killer who had to hide and wait for them to come for him. He understood that his life would now become a game of survival. He had to be careful and cautious not to fall into a trap. His mind was focused on one thing: to survive at any cost, to hide all traces, and hope that no one would guess what happened in this abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. Thomas sat in his hideout, aware that time was working against him. Silence surrounded him, but in his head, there was a constant noise of thoughts and fears. He knew he had done everything he could to hide his crime, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. The next morning, when Emily didn't show up at home, her parents started to worry. They didn't immediately suspect anything serious, thinking that the girl might have stayed late at a friend's or simply forgotten to tell them about her plans. At such moments, they usually called her friends or texted Emily, but this time no one knew where she was. The girl's phone was silent, and this caused concern. As time passed, their concern grew. By midday, they were already calling the police to report their daughter missing. The officers, having taken the report, began standard procedures, calling friends and acquaintances, searching the areas where the girl could have been last seen. The first hours of searching yielded no results. It was a small town, and the disappearance of a teenager was something unusual. The worried parents began to spread information among the locals, and soon the news of Emily's disappearance spread throughout the city. The police took the case very seriously. The disappearance of minors was always considered something extraordinary, and although at the beginning of the investigation, it was assumed that Emily could have simply run away or hidden with one of her friends, soon this version began to crumble. None of her friends had seen her since the day she left school. No one knew where she was going, and this created more and more questions. The police began searching for traces of the girl, using all available resources. They questioned neighbors, checked CCTV cameras near the school and local stores. But Emily seemed to have disappeared. There was no trace of her presence in any of the places where she usually went. This caused even more alarm among investigators. Meanwhile, Thomas, hiding in his abandoned house, continued to watch the events with anxiety and fear. He knew that a full-scale search would soon begin, and his mind was filled with thoughts of how long he could hide. He understood that each day could bring new risks. Someone could remember seeing Emily next to him. Someone could notice them in the park. Panic slowly began to erode his inner peace. The police continued to expand their search area. Soon, they were checking abandoned buildings and empty lots on the outskirts of town. Officers walked empty streets and overgrown fields, trying to find any clues that might lead them to Emily. The girl's parents joined the search, desperately hoping for a lead. The townspeople were alarmed by the disappearance, and many volunteered to help police by combing the surrounding areas. As the days passed, hopes of finding the girl alive began to fade. Police increasingly began to consider the possibility that Emily might have been the victim of a crime. Their search began to focus on places where she might have been hidden or held against her will. Public pressure mounted, and investigators began to look more closely at possible theories about her disappearance. One day, a group of police officers and volunteers reached the area where Thomas's abandoned house was located. The area had always been considered dangerous, but no one suspected that something so terrible could be hidden there. They began to inspect the area around the house, checking every corner. Thomas, inside, realized that his situation was becoming critical. His heart was pounding, and fear was overwhelming him. He knew that if they found the body, he would not escape punishment. As the officers approached the field behind the house, they began to suspect that something was wrong. The grassy areas looked unremarkable, but their attention was drawn to tracks that they noticed had been recently made. Investigators began digging in the area, and their efforts soon yielded horrific results. Under a thin layer of earth, they found Emily's body. Her lifeless body was wrapped in a dirty blanket, and at that moment it became clear that they were dealing with something far more sinister than the simple disappearance of a teenager. The entire town was shocked by this discovery. The news that Emily had been murdered quickly spread, and the police immediately began an investigation to find out who was responsible for this terrible crime. The discovery of Emily's body sent shockwaves through the town. The police immediately cordoned off the area where the grave was found and launched a full investigation. The locals were shocked by what had happened, and there was an air of fear and distrust. No one could understand how such a cruel act could happen in their small, seemingly safe community. Investigators who arrived at the scene immediately realized that they were dealing with a serious crime. An examination of the body confirmed that the girl had died a violent death. The police began collecting evidence at the burial site, trying to find any traces that could help in the investigation. They carefully examined the abandoned house where Thomas lived, trying to find signs that Emily had been there before her death. Forensic experts set to work, recording every trace and every detail. Samples were taken from the soil, clothing, and objects found that could link the body to the crime scene. The questions kept coming, and each one demanded an answer immediately. The main one was, who could have committed this brutal murder? The police began questioning anyone who might have had any connection to Emily. The girl's parents, friends, teachers, all were questioned in the hope that someone could shed light on Emily's final days. The parents were in deep shock and could not understand who could have harmed their daughter. Their testimony was important, but it did not give investigators a clear direction. No one knew who Emily might have been hanging out with outside the home or why she was in this abandoned place. One of the detectives working on the case began to remember people living on the outskirts of town. There were always a few homeless people in their town who might live in abandoned houses like these. And although this was only the beginning of the investigation, the investigators began to suspect that one of these people might be involved in the disappearance and death of the girl. They decided to check all the places where homeless people might live. Thomas, meanwhile, was in a state of extreme stress. He knew that the police were already there, and that they would definitely find out who was behind this crime. His thoughts were full of chaos. He was running through possible scenarios in his head in which he could escape, but each of them seemed unrealistic. All his plans were falling apart, and fear was taking hold of him with renewed vigor. He knew that the police would sooner or later turn their attention to him, and he was prepared for the fact that he would be caught. Investigators began combing abandoned buildings and empty lots for more clues and suspects. That's when they stumbled upon Thomas. His appearance, his demeanor, and the fact that he lived in close proximity to where the body was found caught the officers' attention. Thomas tried to appear calm, but his nervousness was obvious. He knew that any misstep could give him away. The police put Thomas under surveillance. They didn't press charges right away, but his name started popping up in conversations between detectives. They wanted to gather more evidence to keep an eye on the possible culprit. At the same time, they started checking his background, trying to figure out who this man was and what could have led him to do such a terrible thing. Forensic experts continued to work with Emily's body. All necessary examinations were carried out to help the investigators. Soon, the police had their first results in hand. Traces were found on the girl's clothes that could have belonged to her killer. This evidence became the most important link in the investigation chain. Suspicions about Thomas grew, and he was soon brought in for questioning. He knew his days as a free man were numbered, but he tried to keep his cool. The police began with general questions about his life, trying not to scare him. Thomas answered evasively, trying not to reveal that he knew about Emily's death. But the detectives were experienced, and they sensed that something was wrong. His answers were too thoughtful and at the same time too superficial. During the interrogation, Thomas became increasingly nervous, and this did not escape the attention of the investigators. They began asking him more specific questions about the last days and his whereabouts during Emily's disappearance. Thomas realized that with each passing minute he was falling deeper into a trap from which he could no longer escape. After several hours of questioning, the police continued to gather evidence to build a complete picture of the crime. Thomas was nervous. His answers were becoming increasingly confused, and this only strengthened the detectives' suspicions. Soon they received confirmation that traces found on Emily's body and clothing matched Thomas's biological samples. This was a turning point in the investigation. Based on this evidence, the police obtained a warrant for Thomas's arrest. His arrest was calm. He no longer resisted, realizing that there was no point in struggling any further. As soon as he was taken to the police station, a more detailed interrogation began. Thomas initially tried to deny his guilt, claiming that Emily had come to him herself, that everything had been an accident. But his version was weak and untenable. Under the weight of the evidence, Thomas gradually began to break down. He knew that his lies would not save him, and soon the detectives managed to beat a confession out of him. He told how he met Emily, how he gradually gained her trust, and how their strange, frightening relationship developed into something terrible. Thomas tried to justify himself by saying that he never planned to kill the girl, but when she tried to leave, he simply lost control. However, his explanations sounded like pathetic attempts to avoid fully realizing his guilt. Since Thomas's confession, the investigation has become much clearer. The police began to reconstruct the chronology of events, how Emily ran away from home to meet Thomas, how she came to his abandoned house, and how their meeting ended in tragedy. Detectives carefully checked every detail, comparing Thomas's testimony with the facts, and the picture of the crime became clearer. The locals were shocked. Thomas, who had been an unnoticed homeless man for years, had turned out to be the teenager's killer. The town was in a state of horror and grief. People couldn't believe that this could happen in their small, and as they thought, safe community. Emily's parents, upon learning of Thomas's confession, were devastated. They couldn't come to terms with the idea that their daughter had fallen into the hands of such a man, and now they would have to live with this loss for the rest of their lives. The investigation continued to work, collecting additional evidence to build a solid case. All the collected materials were analyzed: clothes, surveillance footage, traces of a struggle in Thomas's house. Everything pointed to him being the killer. The forensic examination confirmed that Emily's death was violent and left no doubt that Thomas was involved. Meanwhile, the case had gained resonance in the local press. Journalists actively covered every step of the investigation, and the story of a missing girl who had been brutally murdered spread throughout the region. The events caused a wave of public indignation. People demanded justice and punishment for the culprit, and Thomas found himself at the center of this anger. When the case was ready to go to trial, the case against Thomas was overwhelming. His confession, the evidence collected, and the testimony of witnesses created a clear picture of the crime. Investigators did everything possible to reconstruct the events of that fateful day in as much detail as possible, and the charge of Emily's murder was officially filed. While Thomas was waiting for his trial, his condition worsened. He realized that he had no chance of being acquitted. His guilt had been proven, and now he had to stand trial, where his fate would be finally decided. Thomas could no longer hide from the truth. He had become a murderer, and his life had come to a tragic end. When the trial began, the entire community was watching the proceedings closely. The court sessions attracted the attention of not only the city's residents, but also people from outside the city. Emily's family was present at the trial, demanding justice for their daughter. The trial was difficult. Thomas's lawyers tried to mitigate his guilt, but the evidence was too strong. In the end, Thomas was found guilty. The court handed down a harsh sentence, which brought some relief to Emily's family and the townspeople. Thomas would spend the rest of his life in prison, and his punishment became the final chapter of this tragic story. Thomas's trial generated a wave of interest from locals and the media. The city's district court was packed with reporters, Emily's relatives, and people shocked by this horrific crime. For many, the story was a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, and no one is immune to such tragedies. The trial lasted for several weeks. Prosecutors painstakingly reconstructed the chronology of events, showing the jury all the evidence collected at the crime scene and during the investigation. The results of the forensic examination were presented, which clearly pointed to Thomas as Emily's killer. Evidence found at the crime scene, such as his biological traces on the girl's body, left little doubt about his guilt. Emily's family attended every hearing, their faces contorted with pain but trying to maintain dignity as they watched justice being done. For them, this trial was an opportunity to seek justice for their daughter, and every day in court was a reminder of their irreparable loss. Thomas's lawyers tried to build a defense on the fact that his actions were not pre-planned, that he did not intend to kill the girl. They claimed that it was an outburst of rage caused by his unstable mental state. They also referred to his difficult life, constant suffering and difficult life circumstances, which allegedly made him unable to control his actions at a critical moment. But these arguments failed to convince the court or the jury. Prosecutors insisted that despite Thomas's difficult life, his crime was deliberate and cruel. They pointed to his manipulation of Emily, the way he gained her trust, gradually drawing her into his traps. This was not a random crime. It was a calculated exploitation of a young girl that ended in her death. Testimony from psychological experts also played a major role in the trial. They confirmed that Thomas was fully aware of his actions at the time of the murder and was in control of himself, but that he had deliberately chosen to commit the crime. They spoke of his manipulative tendencies and his desire to use Emily for his own ends. These statements only strengthened the jury's belief that Thomas deserved a harsh sentence. The court hearings were accompanied by intense public attention. People came to the courthouse holding signs demanding justice for Emily and condemning Thomas. Many expressed their outrage that a man like Thomas had lived among them without attracting attention until this tragedy occurred. They demanded that such incidents not happen again and that all homeless and marginalized people in their city be closely monitored. When the day of sentencing arrived, the courtroom was filled with an oppressive silence. The jury had returned a verdict. Thomas was guilty of premeditated murder. The verdict was an expected outcome of the entire trial, but it still caused a storm of emotion in the courtroom. Emily's parents could not hold back their tears, realizing that justice had finally been served. But this victory could not bring their daughter back, and the pain of her loss remained unbearable. The judge announced the sentence. Thomas would spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. It was the maximum sentence that could be imposed, and it became a model for similar cases in the future. Thomas listened to the sentence in silence, showing no emotion. His face was impassive, as if he had already resigned himself to the inevitable. After the trial ended, the city tried to come to terms with the terrible tragedy. Emily's family was eager to start a new life, but it was difficult knowing that their daughter was gone forever. The public debated at length about safety measures and how to prevent such tragedies in the future. Thomas, meanwhile, went to prison, where he faced years of isolation and contemplation of his crime. His name became a symbol of horror and cruelty, and his life ended in oblivion, leaving only a mark in history as the man who committed one of the most horrific crimes in the history of their city. After the trial, the city gradually began to return to normal life, but the traces of the tragedy remained forever. Emily's story and her brutal death shocked everyone, and many could not recover from what happened for a long time. The girl's parents tried to move on with their lives, but their home, which had once been filled with laughter and joy, now seemed empty and cold. The pain of loss was unbearable, and every memory of their daughter brought a new wave of suffering. Emily's mother, Sarah, had stopped working. She woke up every day feeling like everything around her was pointless. Her thoughts were consumed with memories of her daughter. She would often sit in her room, leafing through old photographs, feeling like it was the only connection she had left. Emily's father, John, was going through a tough time too, but he was trying to hold on for his wife. He knew that if he broke, Sarah would lose her last support. They rarely spoke about what had happened, but the silence was deafening. The city had changed. Locals began to look at people on the margins of society differently. The indifference with which many had previously treated the homeless and marginalized was replaced by fear and suspicion. Many demanded that the authorities tighten control over such people, believing that their presence in the city could lead to a similar tragedy again. The city administration began to consider new programs for the homeless, but this discussion was controversial. Some believed in increasing social support, while others insisted on isolating such people from society. The spot where Emily's body was found became a memorial of sorts. People from the town came to leave flowers, candles, stuffed animals, anything that could pay tribute to the girl they would never forget. The field behind the abandoned house where Thomas hid the body was now overgrown, but its significance became a symbol for all who wanted to honor Emily's memory. Meanwhile, Thomas was in prison, where his life had become a slow death. He was no longer the man who lived on the streets and tried to survive in abandoned houses. Now he was a prisoner, and his name had become synonymous with horror. He was not welcome in prison. Even among criminals, there is an understanding of the unacceptability of certain actions, and the murder of an underage girl earned the contempt of other prisoners. The first months of his stay in prison were particularly difficult. He was isolated from other prisoners to avoid attacks, but this only increased his loneliness and fear. Thomas lived in a small cell, spending his days thinking about what led him to this end. But he felt no true remorse. His mind was full of excuses and attempts to shift the blame onto circumstances and his past life. He did not fully understand how cruel his actions were. Periodic interrogations by psychologists and guards revealed that Thomas had not changed. He remained cold and distant. His inner world was destroyed, but not because of guilt. He only regretted being caught. Emily's fate, as well as her family, did not interest him. For Thomas, his crime had become something inevitable in a series of failures and sufferings that he had experienced throughout his life. However, the public did not forget about Thomas. His name occasionally appeared in the news when discussing the conditions of criminal detention or possible reforms to the social welfare system. In people's minds, he remained the man who destroyed the life of an innocent girl and her family. People who lived in this small town were afraid for a long time that such cases would happen again. Local schools and services began to conduct safety programs for children, urging them not to trust strangers and to be careful in their interactions. Thomas's fate was sealed. His sentence meant he would spend the rest of his days alone, deprived of his freedom, but it brought no closure to his victim or her family. For Emily's parents, justice had been achieved, but the pain of their loss remained. Their lives were forever changed, and each morning, as they woke up to an empty house, they were reminded that they had to go on with their lives, despite all that had happened. Life after Emily's death had been a challenge for her parents. Months had passed since Thomas's conviction, but no punishment could bring their daughter back or ease the pain of her loss. The house that had once been full of laughter and warmth was now an oppressive silence. Every room was a reminder of her childhood toys, her school books, and pictures of her smiling. These little things weighed heavily on her parents, but they were also the only things that remained of their daughter. Emily's mother, Sarah, barely left the house. Her world had narrowed to the walls of their family home, which had now become a prison for her. She spent hours sitting in Emily's room, leafing through photo albums or simply looking out the window, remembering the moments when her daughter was there. Every day was a struggle with herself, with a sense of guilt and meaninglessness. She felt like she had failed to protect her daughter, and this feeling was eating her up from the inside. Emily's father, John, also suffered, but tried to support his wife. He tried to work, doing everyday things to somehow distract himself from the pain. But every time he returned home, he felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. John often went to the workshop, where he repaired old things, trying to distract himself from thoughts about what had happened. For him, it was a way to throw out the pain and anger that he could not express in words. Emily's family received support from neighbors and friends, but no amount of sympathy could ease their suffering. They began to isolate themselves from the world around them, trying not to draw unnecessary attention to their pain. They found it difficult to relate to people who could not understand what they had been through. Living in this small town, which had once seemed so cozy and safe, now became a reminder that evil can lurk anywhere. Meanwhile, local schools and agencies began aggressive safety programs for children and teens. Parents were given advice on how to teach their children to be cautious and not to trust strangers, especially strangers like Thomas. Teachers spent time in class talking to students about personal safety, explaining that they could always ask for help if someone tried to control or manipulate them. The incident became a lesson for the city, leading to a rethink of how child protection systems should work. At the same time, the city administration began to review programs for the homeless and those on the margins of society. Many residents demanded that such people be strictly supervised, believing that such tragedies could be prevented. However, part of the community realized that not everyone who ended up on the streets was a threat, and perhaps the best solution was to provide social services that could prevent people like Thomas from becoming dangerous criminals. For Emily's parents, any changes or new programs no longer mattered. Their pain was deeply personal, and no public measures could bring back what they had lost. At some point, John and Sarah realized that they could no longer live in this city. Every corner reminded them of the tragedy. Every glance from their neighbors was full of sympathy, which only increased their suffering. They decided to sell their house and move to another city, hoping that a change of scenery would at least help them start a new life. The move was a difficult step for both of them. It meant leaving behind the place where they had spent so many happy years with their daughter, but it was no longer possible to stay there. They packed up their belongings, including their most precious memories of Emily, her photographs, favorite books, toys. They took all of this with them, knowing that these items would always remind them of their daughter, no matter where they were. The new city gave Sarah and John a fresh start. Although they knew their pain would never go away, they hoped it would become less intense with time. No one knew about their past here, which gave them a chance to live without constant reminders of what had happened. They tried to support each other, although each of them continued to grieve the tragedy in their own way. Sarah began seeing a therapist, realizing she needed help to deal with the emotional trauma. John also began therapy, realizing that his anger and pain were destroying him from the inside. Slowly but surely, they began to heal. Although the pain of loss would always be a part of their lives, they knew they had to move on in memory of their daughter. After moving to a new town, life slowly began to take on a different shape for Sarah and John. Their new home was much smaller than before, but that was a conscious choice. They no longer wanted to live in a large, empty house that would remind them of their loss. In this small town, they could be anonymous, allowing them to rebuild their lives, away from prying eyes and constant reminders of the tragedy. Sarah felt lost for a long time, but therapy began to bear fruit. Her therapist helped her overcome the guilt and self-blame she had felt since Emily's death. She slowly began to realize that she could not have prevented this tragedy, and that her love for her daughter was not a weakness or a mistake, but on the contrary, what helped her keep Emily's memory alive. With each new session, Sarah learned to let go of the past, although it was impossible to completely get rid of the pain. She took up gardening, turning their small backyard into a lush haven of peace and tranquility. She worked with plants every day, believing that caring for living things helped her cope with the pain of loss. The garden became a symbol of restoration for her, and she often spent long hours there, thinking about life, the past, and how to live with that burden. John also struggled to find his place in his new life. Therapy helped him realize that his anger and desire for revenge would not bring him peace. He learned to manage his emotions and began to find ways to express his feelings through creativity. He had always enjoyed working with his hands, and now he began to create sculptures out of wood that reminded him of different aspects of his life. These works became a form of self-expression for him and a way to release the pain he carried inside. One day, John decided to create a sculpture dedicated to Emily. He began working on it during the long evenings, using every free moment to put a piece of his soul into his work. It was a sculpture of a little girl looking at the sky, as if she was reaching for something more. For John, it was the personification of how he wanted to remember his daughter, full of dreams and aspirations that no one could destroy. When the sculpture was finished, John placed it in the garden that Sarah had so lovingly landscaped. It became a symbol of Emily's memory for them, but without the devastating pain they had experienced in the past. Instead, they found a quiet resignation and acceptance that life, despite its cruelty, goes on. Over time, Sarah and John began to build relationships with their new neighbors, slowly opening up to the people with whom they began to share their new existence. No one in their new community knew about the tragedy, and this gave them space to build relationships without the burden of the past. They learned to live with the pain, accepting it as a part of their lives, but not allowing it to control their future. Sarah began working at the local library, returning to what she once loved. She loved helping children find books, seeing their excited faces as they discovered a new world through the pages. It gave her a sense of accomplishment and reminded her that there was a silver lining in the world. Every day, she tried to find the little joys in life that helped her move forward. John, in turn, began teaching crafts at a local school. He taught teenagers how to work with wood, telling them how art can be a way to express emotions and experiences. Working with children, he felt that he could somehow contribute to their future, helping them develop and discover their talents. For Sarah and John, the new life was not easy, but they gradually learned to cope with the loss, finding meaning in each new day. Their story became an example of how to live after a tragedy, how, despite the pain, you can continue to build your future. They knew that they would never forget their daughter, but they learned to live with this knowledge, accepting it as part of their destiny. Every morning, looking at Emily's sculpture in the garden, Sarah and John remembered her with love and tenderness. This memory became for them not a source of pain, but a source of strength that helped them to continue living. As the years passed, Sarah and John's lives began to take on a new, calmer course. The memory of Emily remained in their hearts, but it was no longer the unbearable burden that oppressed and destroyed them from within. Instead, they found a way to embrace it, turning their pain into a source of inner strength and wisdom. Every year, on Emily's birthday, they would gather in their garden to celebrate her life. It was a special day when they didn't cry, but remembered the happy moments they had shared with their daughter. Sarah would bring her favorite flowers, white lilies, which had always brought Emily joy when she was alive. John would light a candle and place it next to the sculpture he had made in memory of his daughter. It had become a tradition for them, quiet but meaningful, allowing them to feel that Emily would always be with them. With each passing year, they became more and more aware that the loss they had experienced had become part of their lives. But that did not mean that life had stopped. They learned to find joy in the little things, in quiet evenings on the terrace, in the sound of rain pounding the roof, in the rare visits of new friends who became their support. These simple joys in life helped them realize that, despite all the tragedies, life continues to go on as usual. The time spent in the garden became especially precious to them. They tended the plants with love, as something that connected them with the memory of their daughter. The garden blossomed, and with each new season, more and more flowers and greenery appeared in it. This place became a symbol of rebirth for them, not only of nature, but also of their inner world. One day, old friends from their former city came to visit them. It was a difficult meeting because the friends knew about the tragedy and had not seen Sarah and John for a long time. They spent the evening together, reminiscing about the past, but without the heaviness that once filled such conversations. The friends were surprised at how much Sarah and John had changed, how they were able to find the strength to continue living after such a loss. Sarah and John told them it had been a long process, full of pain and loss, but that they had eventually learned to live with what had happened. They made no secret of the fact that losing Emily had changed them forever, but they now found solace in the fact that they had done everything they could to keep her memory alive. They told their friends about their garden, about the sculpture, about how seeing their daughter's face every morning brought them not only grief, but also warmth. Sarah admitted that for a long time she was afraid of forgetting Emily, afraid that over time the memories of her would fade. But now she realized that memory lives not in words or images, but in the feelings they continue to experience. Every time she saw lilies in bloom or heard children's laughter on the street, she remembered her daughter, but it no longer caused painful tears, but only quiet sadness and gratitude that Emily was a part of their lives. John spoke about his work with children at school. He understood that his task now was to pass on his knowledge and experience to the younger generation who needed support. For him, this became a way to return to the world the kindness and care that he was unable to give to his daughter. Each child he worked with became a part of this great process of education, and this brought him comfort. As the evening wore on, Friends said their goodbyes, and Sarah and John sat in their garden, surrounded by flowers and memories. They knew that life would go on, and they had to go with it. Emily would always be there, but now it was not a wound, but a source of strength. Looking at the sunset, they knew there were still many challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them. They had been through the worst thing that could happen to parents, and it had made them stronger and closer to each other. Life went on, and they accepted it with all its joys and sufferings, knowing that every day was a new opportunity to find meaning in the little things. The years passed quickly, and life continued as usual for Sarah and John. Their garden, which had become a symbol of rebirth and the memory of their daughter, was now an oasis. Flowers bloomed every spring, and birds chirped in the trees. For them, this garden was not only a place where they could retreat and remember Emily, but also a symbol of the amazing ability of life to continue despite all the tragedies. By this time, Sarah had gotten used to life in a new city. Working at the library brought her joy and a sense of belonging. Her interactions with the children, their innocence and curiosity, helped her remember those moments when Emily was little. Every time she saw a child walk away with a book in her hands, Sarah felt that perhaps she was passing a piece of her daughter into this world without even realizing it. John, who continued his work with teenagers at school, also found solace in the fact that he could make a positive difference in the lives of others. His craft classes were popular with the students, and many looked to John as a mentor who not only taught them a craft, but also helped them find inner balance. For John, these students were an opportunity to pass on his love and care to those who still needed support and attention. Yet despite their outward calm, Sarah and John knew that their lives had changed forever. They accepted this reality with deep humility. Their experiences had become part of who they were, but they no longer brought the pain that had once torn their hearts to pieces. Instead, they came to a deep understanding that life is a series of losses and gains, and that in this world, suffering cannot be avoided, but it can be learned to live with it. Every anniversary of Emily's death, they still gathered in their garden, placing a candle next to her sculpture. This ritual became a special moment of silence and reflection for them. They did not speak much on such days, but their silence was more eloquent than words. Both knew that their daughter would always be with them, no matter what happened. These moments became a reminder that Emily continued to live in their hearts, like an eternal light that would not go out. One evening, sitting on the terrace, Sarah looked at John and quietly said that despite all the pain, they had found the strength to move on. She confessed that she had thought she would never get over this loss, but now she understood that Emily would want them to be happy. These words were a kind of release for them. John nodded in response to her confession, feeling the same deep connection to the past and present that bound them to the memory of their daughter. Time passed, and old age gradually began to come into their lives. They began to spend more time together, enjoying quiet evenings and conversations. Every minute became precious to them. They learned to appreciate the little things and see beauty in the simplest things. One autumn evening, when the leaves were falling from the trees, covering the garden in gold and red, Sarah sat on a bench in front of Emily's sculpture. The wind gently moved her hair, and she felt at peace. In that moment, she realized that she had found peace. Her life had been full of trials, but she had overcome them. She remembered the words she had once read in one of Emily's favorite books. "Love never dies, it just changes form." Those words sank deep into her soul, and she realized that the love for her daughter would never go away. It had just become something else, quiet, but no less important. John joined her on the bench, and they sat in silence for a long time, looking out at the garden that had become a symbol of their new life. They knew they had time to spend together, but most importantly, they found peace and an understanding that everything they had been through had not been in vain. Their lives after the tragedy were not easy, but they were able to recover, find comfort in each other, and in the fact that their love for Emily would always be with them wherever they went.